kinds of questions which we have never heard in India now, till now. Why should it matter to the larger society? But suppose somebody comes and asks you that, then you see, look at the way in which the answers are phrased by people. You can just do a very simple empirical discourse analysis of it. In the way people respond to these questions, it's often putting yourself behind some norms of tradition. Which is, if you say, why are you wearing a particular kind of dress? Then I'll say, that's my religion, community, practice, cultural practice, social practice, etc. Nowhere is the question that is the practice I want to do to declare myself in a particular way. I was just telling Dr. Shiva yesterday about these cases, in that region where I come from, two young girls, medical students from definitely upper class Muslim families, decided to wear the hijab and said we want to do it as a form of declaration, not as a form of traditional practices. And it's a very important form for their, and I'm sure you've heard of many cases like this in the West and in India and so on. So the point is, the way in which you invoke something to understand your practice, which others call as minority practice, is to invoke a notion of tradition, which always happens in majority and minority. But what I'm trying to point out is, majority will use the idea of tradition in a different way than the minority will use the idea of tradition. The majority will use the idea of tradition as a means of unification, as a means of saying we all come under that tradition, we belong to that tradition. And for minority, by the very nature of the multiplicity of minority, they will use tradition as a form of protection, as a form of the wall within which different minorities are constituted. Whether it is ethnic minorities, social minorities, cultural minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. And therefore, they change it. To me, see, remember the repeated point. You may be wondering why I'm doing all this stuff, other than as a philosophical exercise. The point is, I think I'll explain to you why. Hopefully, all this should make sense to you in the end. But the point is to show how these character of majority and minority are not just in terms of few numbers or more numbers, but there are essential differences in the way the relationship which binds the majority and minority have to be defined. So it's not that a minority which will go from 10 members to 100 members will become majority. That's the point I'm trying to say. If it is just about numbers, you have some 10 people as minority, let us say, and then tomorrow they become 1,000. It's not going to become majority in this sense, unless all these things also happen, because these are the characteristics of majority and minority, not just about numbers. So the fact of tradition is used differently from these two. Also then finally lead, in terms of discourse, majority is associated with the notion of duties and minorities with the notion of rights. Again, I think something which is deep consequence on the way we understand the politics of majority minority, but the question of rights get appropriated into the discourse of minorities, and the question of duties become appropriated in the domain of majority. And that, therefore, the implications of that, as I said, are deep and influence much of the way we commonly talk about it. Okay, I will then end with finally, as the final notion of the values of majority-minority by showing a paradox in all this. A very deep paradox in a globalized, great capitalist societies, as of global societies of today, and how these notions of majority and minority have to confront this fundamental challenge at the heart of it. And the problem is this: the majority signifies, as in the way we understand in the practice of majority, to put a very negative sense of the word connotation to majority signifies a mob. It's largely a collection of people who think they want to think alike, be alike, act alike. In other words, non-flattering description of majority is a mob. Now, in post-capitalistic enterprises, and today, which is now reached at all levels, the question of enterprise is very important. And enterprise is never that of the mob. The enterprise, what I mean by enterprise is an individual's capacity to do something independent of what others think, which becomes a very important marker of not just of individual autonomy, but also of business, art, science, All of them, if you look at this very interesting trajectory of the idea of creativity and autonomy of the self, that is only counterposed with the other opposition, which is mob thinking versus creative thinking. So here you have quote unquote minorities artists, minorities like scientists, and business entrepreneurs who tend to think that thinking differently from others and acting differently from others is the only solution for today's world. In fact, it has become so much a part of education today that every college that I know, engineering and other colleges, all have started these are called innovation hubs. Even small colleges near Bangalore, that day they inaugurated an innovation hub, where you are supposed to make all students innovate. What do they mean by innovate? Don't think like others around you. So, here is a very fascinating question of the formation of majority and minority in a culture which privileges the importance of not being like others and thinking like others. In other words, in a world in which the notion of variety is finally that saying, I don't know who said it when, which era, variety is the spice of life. Variety is the spice of life. Is it? I had heard it long back and I thought it's a well-known statement, but let's assume it is. But I'm saying variety is spice of life has become so true today that we are not, look at the way we ourselves as a society are. Every time somebody talks to me my age about old India, they'll say, oh, you remember the days we had only ambassador car? To them, the only ambassador car is a sign of variety and development, of course, for us. But what is this development? It has given us a choice-based development, which is the model of development. The choice-based development is just a possibility of giving you a variety of things on display. In fact, one of my greatest shifts which happened to me when I moved from Bangalore to Manipal is such a small, it's probably 1/100th of Kalady. It's just one road actually. Was the fact that in Bangalore, there is so much pressure to be variety. That is, if you eat in one restaurant today, they will not want to eat in the same restaurant tomorrow. They'll say, I have to eat, if they eat South Indian, they say I have to eat Chinese tomorrow. And then Chinese, by the time I left Bangalore, people had got bored of Chinese. There are 100 Chinese restaurants. They said I have to eat Japanese. And this time last summer when I went, they have Korean. The point is, variety is defining what you mean by freedom and choice. It's just like having 20 different clothes, 40 different types of cars on display. That's why I use Ambassador. Ambassador is such a great example of a world without variety, where you only had Ambassador and then Air India if you wanted to travel. You now have these multiple choices and we think something has happened in this multiplicity. So this notion of variety is, what I'm trying to point out is, that notion of variety is based on the possibility of breaking monotony, uniformity, homogeneity and sameness. To the extent, and I have given this example many times and all my students laugh at this, but I'll say it because it's very close to my heart. Because I like idlis, wherever I travel I explore idlis. I think it's a great dish. And then what they have done with idlis, idlis are these innocent things, right, which is just steam. There's nothing in idli, you just steam it, it's white and it's very soft and everything. And then in Bangalore it happened first, they started making things called idli Manchurian, idli 65, idli Szechuan, and somewhere else I saw in Coimbatore idli Mexican. A simple thing called idli which has completely changed and transformed. Because why? Because people who have buying capacity, the so-called urban elite, don't want to eat the same soft idli every day. They are bored. They are bored with sameness. And the only way you can satisfy this urge against sameness is to simulate a variety which is available to you. In such a world, where is the notion of majority and minority? This fundamental tension between majority and minority is played out in this world in which variety is so much privileged, where creativity is so much privileged. So, in the context of majority, you have ideas of following and conformity, and in the idea also of the minority, you will have individualistic and creativity. They stand for that. They stand for the possibility of difference itself being a great social and cultural value of contemporary late capitalism. Then how do you engage with this larger question? Because as I said, if you look at art and science practice as examples, they're very clear. I mean, if you look at all the discourse in art and science, it's all about not being a mob, not being a majority figure. That is, in other words, those things which bring together you as a majority and minority are not what can enable some of the most important human practices of societies. So how does this play out in the larger context of social and cultural majority-minority distinction? I'll just end with the final point about this meaning of this. Again, I won't talk much about it because it's something far more, far more detailed. But I think it's a very important distinction between majority and minority in the context of its value. And it is the association of a very big difference between the idea of consent and the idea of truth. I will put consent under majority. That is, the idea of majority is driven by consent. Consent with various forms. You can invoke Chomsky on one hand, you can invoke various others on the idea of problem of consent, but consent becomes a very important marker of the possibility of majority. To be majority is to find ways of consenting. To be a minority as an idea, I'm not reducing it to minorities as religious or cultural minorities, minority as an idea, truth becomes far more important. And there's a very important distinction between consent and truth. Consent is actually quite independent of truth. But if you want to make this distinction and explore the possibilities that consent and truth can give you a very rich yield on the distinction between minority and majority, then you'll have to invoke different theories of truth, what we mean by truth. In other words, it could be between conformity and insight, those kind of distinctions which you need to invoke in order to make this distinction. So as I said, I'm not going to go deeper into it. If you have questions, we can talk about it. But I think to me that's an extremely important implication of the conceptualization of majority and minority, this distinction between consent and truth. Okay, therefore, why am I doing all this? There are various reasons why. As I said, for me, one for my own clarification of what I mean by minority and majority, etc., etc. But in terms of the social processes, I think these are important for these reasons. One, whenever we use the term minority, majority in any discussion, every time we use majority, minority, we think they mean about numbers. We act as if they're talking about minority as being as numbers. And then when we find people talking across each other, you actually realize they're not meaning the same thing, but they're using the same word. That's very much part of language, right? And as I use the example in my language classes, if you tell somebody comes and says, oh, I'm cool, you don't want to give a blanket to that person. You don't have to give a blanket to the person. Because you may be talking about and have a big fight about whether he is really cool or not cool. But how you're going to interpret cool and act on it is very different depending on the meaning of that connotation of the word. All I'm pointing out is minority is like cool. When it is being used by certain people, they're actually meaning very different senses of the term, different contextual meanings of this term. And they hide all the meanings that I've given you within majority and minority. And therefore, knowing the complex meanings of majority and minority make it easier for us to engage the questions about it. It helps us to go beyond minority as mere numbers. It also looks at, this I'll skip the point about imagination. And the most important point for me, and I'll end with this position, is very simple. It's a question of public representation. As I said earlier when I began, that the idea of minority begins from a clutch of other concepts like nation, state, and one of which was representation, enumeration senses, and representation. The problem of minorities, if you want to look at it politically, is only a problem of representation. There's no other problem of minority. Problem of representation, minorities are worried if they are not represented in the social world they belong to. And within the minorities, who speaks for the minorities is also a very important question. So in other words, how is a minority itself getting represented? The definition of minority is, it has to be represented because the worry is that you will not get represented if you are a minority. But on the other hand, what are the ethics and politics of representation itself within the minorities? So that question of who is going to represent the minorities becomes an extremely important, because, and this is where I come back to what I began with and also what Shiba was saying about different academics and research. And the point is this, that if you do not have a public democratic representation, then communities get represented by beliefs, practices, codes, as seen by others. That's a very deep troubling problem, which is the representation of a minority today is very often in terms of what others are doing by others, by outsiders who now use a set of practices to stand for that community. But that is not, set of practices cannot stand for a community. And the only way in which people can stand for that community is if it is a public democratic process. Because, so this question of minority presenting itself beside the majority and people within the minority speaking for the minority. And those two questions of representation, in my view at least, has to be underlined by a very deep commitment to public democratic processes. Because to me the challenge, if you don't do that, is that there's a constant challenge. Just like the majority is always under constant threat of instability, breaking up into minorities, the minority is constantly under threat of behaving like a majority. That is the big problem. And you behave like a majority when you do to your minorities within minorities what the majority does vis-a-vis the minorities. So these two tensions really animate the minority-majority debate. And they are at the heart of the problem of even understanding what these kinds of things are about. And therefore, to me, I don't like to end with this point, but I think it's, it's there vaguely in the top of my head and I'm not developing it. But I think, therefore, the question of a minority, therefore, the response of the minority towards the majority, I think has to be a way in which the minority takes on a higher moral position. And that's the only way in which this is possible, which is being members of minority is not to present yourself in all the various contexts that you have seen, but to present oneself in the minority mode as occupying a higher moral position. I'm thinking of this is a very badly formed, loosely formed idea which has been tossing in my head for a couple of days. But I'm looking at it mainly as one example, Gandhi as the exemplar minority. There is something which Gandhi does which is very deeply related not to the question of minorities as other communities and so on, but in his practice, functioning like a notion of a minority. And I think that idea, and how Gandhi gets away with it, is by constantly attaching his particular sets of actions with higher moral actions. And I think perhaps there's a lesson in that. I may be completely wrong on this, but it's just something which I'm sharing with you, still trying to think through it. But I really think the question of the minority, therefore, if it has to not give in to these tensions of the majority and all the problems attaches itself to the majority, has to find itself, articulate itself in terms of certain kinds of higher moral positions within a larger society. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarukkai, for inviting us to the nuances of becoming minority. Now it is time for a discussion, and we have two discussants with us. They will lead, and then, as time permits, the members of the audience should definitely come with their suggestions or criticism or clarifications. I first invite Professor P.K. Hawker for his responses to the presentation.
Dear friends, ആദ്യമായി ഷമീറിൻ്റെ കുടുംബത്തിൻ്റെയും സുഹൃത്തുക്കളുടെയും അധ്യാപകരുടെയും ദുഃഖത്തിൽ ഞാനും പങ്കുചേരുകയാണ്. So I congratulate the Department of History and Shamir Foundation for making this horrible occasion into a meaningful deliberation. As we have heard, Dr. Sundar Sarukkai talked about becoming minority. On the other hand, I will be talking on being minority. I have been talking on becoming minority, and in spite of his good intentions, I am afraid whether he is slipping to or somehow slipping to the majoritarian perspective of the minority. Whenever he talks about the fear of minority, the majority-minority number issue, the moral question, so on and so forth. So many things are there to be responded with, but I am not taking my time or the timing for such kind of responses. Anyhow, we know that Professor Sarukkai, after his crack to the has shown his commitment towards the real issues of our country, especially from the Sanskrit perspective. When I am talking about being minority, I remember an occasion while I was living in Telchar. My daughter Adria was playing in the front yard of Professor M.N. Vijay. And I was discussing with him the problem of transcending religious identity or communal identity. And some debates were going on between us. I told him that my first daughter is Darshana, second daughter is Adya. When Darshana entered the school, I didn't enter any caste or religion, so on and so forth. Then he told me a single word. They will scratch. He showed like this. They will scratch. Amazingly, both of my daughters, from first standard to even yet, reports me several times that they are scratching. They are asking, "You are Darsana, still you are talking about Uppa, why? What is the problem?" Some of them ask, "You have no earring, you are a Pentecost." Some of them ask whether your father married a Hindu. So many questions they are facing from at least from the early school days to even recently. So what I am telling is that being minority within minority, now I realize that it is a very crucial issue which actually is to be examined in relation to the hegemonic ideology of our country rather than simply a number of a certain community or the number of the majority or minority or whatever. It is exclusively, so many things are there to be discussed, but I know as Dr. Shiva earlier mentioned, time is comparatively less since it is only a discussion as part of this presentation. Anyhow, when I thought of this topic after Shiva's call, I just noted down certain points which I will read out here. Minority is a socio-political issue. In Indian Constitution, the word minorities occur in the marginal note to Article 29. It does not occur in the text. The sender knowingly or unknowingly excludes the minority, and this omission and the status of minority is compliant. Why there is minority in any socio-political sphere? It is a pertinent question wherever there is a sender and there are margins. In academic discourses, core and periphery have been discussed in relation to industrial development. On the other hand, in the Indian context, the mention of minority in the constitution occurs in relation to culture. Religion and language belongs to human culture. The materiality of culture is closely linked to the materiality of ideology. What distinguishes center from margin or core from periphery in spatio-temporal existence of Indian culture? The construction of spatiality of social life is closely related to the hegemonic ideology of any state. In the 2002 judgment in TMF 5 Foundation and others, the state of Karnataka and others, the Supreme Court deliberated on the various contentions that the center, state or a particular region within state may be considered as the basic unit for protection of the right of minorities. I am quoting certain court orders especially because we know the higher court orders are always treated as legally standing or legally applicable to every citizen of the country. Since we are all citizens of India at present, naturally, at present I am telling deliberately because there is plans for sending one or other outside country, as it happened in some cases in India, which we comfortably forget. It is to be noted that in two other important verdicts, the Supreme Court further complicated and confused the definition of minorities. In the Patil judgment case 2005, Justice Dharmadhikari and Justice P.K. Balasubramanian ruled that Jainism is not different from Hinduism and does not belong to minorities. Similarly, Justice Srivastava in 2007 ruled that Muslims by virtue of their number cannot be considered as minority in UP. Most of the honorable judges, despite their erudition in legal matters, failed to understand the spatiality of Indian social life. In the spatiality of Indian social life, the materiality of minority exists in relation to the materiality of language and religion. In the Bal Patil case, the court went to the extent of saying that Jainism is a reformist movement like Brahma Samaja after discussing certain features like Ahimsa, etc. etc. I am not going into details. An examination of hegemonic ideology as conceived by Gamgee is inevitable to understand the status of minority in a hegemonic society. Foucault's heterogeneous and relational space of heterotopias become relevant in this context. Foucault speaks about the real spaces of heterogeneity and unreal or imaginary space of heterogeneity. The spatial distancing between the majority and minority corresponds to that of core and periphery or center and margin. There is a real distance and a constructed distance between the center and margin. The minority always remains in the margins. The exclusion of margins always haunts the minority in many ways. Excluded communities, socially, politically, and culturally, remain in the border space where they feel, think, and act. As far as the margin or periphery is concerned, the exclusion is felt as lived experience. Let me quote from Sundar Sarukkai, page 68 of his Cracked Mirror. All experiences, including sexuality, get constructed around themes such as power and culture. One who belongs to a minority experiences her being minority in relation to the majority, not only in quantitative terms but also in qualitative terms. Power and culture operates physically and mentally in concrete situation and abstract notion. In what way power operates in India is applicable to all states and spaces in the country. Foucault has specifically given examples of power of men over women, of parents over children, of psychiatry over the mentally ill, of medicine over the population, of administration over the ways of life. However, the question of power of majority over minority in terms of religion did not appear in Foucault. At the same time, the way Foucault approached the approaches the power of one group over the other delineates the functioning of power structure in general. As far as India is concerned, Brahminical hegemony has been determining the power structure of the country for a long period. I don't know, inadvertently, Dr. Sarukkai did not mention anything about the Brahminism, even when he mentions about the impurity question of the country. Even while the British ruled India, the hegemonic ideology of caste was involved in the society. From top to bottom, ideology of caste with its emphasis on purity and untouchability reigned over the masses in the whole country from time immemorial. Ideology permeates into masses by means of apparatus of the state. Even while British rule was there in India, even the colonial rule did not do anything drastically to change the caste systems which existed in India. Even nowadays, actually, all the talks about purity, impurity, or touchability, untouchability, or garvapasi, or even the cow slaughter, whatever, we feel that it is somehow around the Brahminical notion of purity and impurity, Brahminical notion of the social existence as such. So, in spite of certain organic intellectuals like Sree or Ayyangali or EBR or number of Sankaracharya or whoever, so many were there in our country, in our state. So many reformers were there. In spite of their attempts, they could not change the social structure. They could somehow improve the social conditions of their existence for certain periods, that's all. Whether we take the example of Sree or Ayyangali or whoever, naturally we will find that their struggles and interventions have produced certain results indeed. But at the same time, they could not, or their interventions could not change the structure, ideological structure of the hegemonic structure of the country, and it is still reigning over the people. That is why I am telling that in the Bal Patil case, when the court says that, when the honorable court says that Jainism is simply an extension of Hinduism, or Honorable Justice Srivastava says that Muslims are not minority in relation to certain state or certain area where their number is higher more. Actually, they simply treat this issue in qualitative terms. That is actually the result of the influence of the natural science upon, not only the influence of natural science upon our way of understanding things, but also the way in which the hegemony interpolates the individuals. A court order is not simply a court order, it becomes the popular belief system as well. So we could not create a counter hegemony in the state, in the society, even nowadays. So as far as we fail to institute counter hegemonies, not a counter, simply a counter hegemony, that is true that variety is the difference is the need of the hour. And if we raise up so many individualities, so many varieties, so many counter hegemonies, naturally the center will get upside down or the center will get toppled. And that is the only way to transcend this also. So while discussing the minority question, the center periphery or core margin comes into the central stage of discussion. Core philosophy in all probability disseminates the ruling ideology rather than peripheries. Buddha became an appendix or supplementary philosophy and never the center of Indian thought. Quantitatively and qualitatively, Buddhism gets a peripheral space in India. Before concluding this talk, let me talk something about the community with which I am supposed to belong. I say I am supposed to belong because by faith I am not a Muslim at all. Because for the last 30-40 years I am not practicing any religion, I am not believing in any such religious god or something of that sort. I am not going attached to any church or mosque or whatsoever. My two of my daughter's certificates, SLC books remain empty in regarding where their religion or caste is to be added in their certificates. In spite of all these things, in spite of all my secular and